Sand slashed across my skin, lightning split the sky wide open, and I knew that one more misstep would leave my body buried forever in the Arizona desert. I was 18 that winter. The wind howled like 1,000 restless spirits, and the rain fell so hard I could no longer tell earth from stone. I didn't know why my legs kept moving, only that if I stopped, the storm would tear me apart. My father, Chinoa White Crow, had always told me, "Be strong as the earth. Never let an enemy see you fall." But that night, the desert needed no enemy to defeat me. It was a killer itself, and I was nothing but a small deer chased into a corner. Just when I thought my strength was gone, I saw it light, a faint glow trembling in the endless dark. I stumbled, rose again, and dragged myself toward it. By the time I collapsed against a rotting wooden fence, I realized it was the lantern of a lonely ranch house. The barn doors creaked open. A man stepped out tall, broad-shouldered, his coat soaked through, a rough beard hiding his jaw. He didn't speak right away. His eyes locked on me, as though trying to decide whether I was flesh and blood or a ghost torn loose from the storm. Then his hand, heavy and calloused, reached out and pulled me inside. The barn smelled of wet hay and horses. My body shook so violently I thought my bones might splinter. The man crouched before me, his gaze narrowing as he took in my soaked leather dress and long black hair clinging to my cheeks. He knew at once I was Apache. "Sit," he rasped, his voice rough as gravel. He stripped off his heavy coat and wrapped it around me. I wanted to protest, to rise and flee, but my strength betrayed me. My body sagged beneath the weight of exhaustion, and all I could do was let his warmth surround me. Then he drew a silver dagger from his belt. Its blade, though scratched and worn, caught the lantern light with a cold gleam. My heart hammered. I thought he meant to end me. But instead, he pressed it into my hand. "Keep it," he said, "at least until the storm passes. Tonight, let it be your shield." The handle felt strange against my palm, almost alive. Among my people, a weapon was never just a tool of war. It was a bond, a vow. I never imagined a white man would place such a thing in my hand. Outside, the storm screamed against the desert cliffs. Inside the barn, I listened to the frantic pounding of my heart, louder than the wind. He didn't know my name, didn't know that I was the daughter of White Crow, leader of the Chiricahua Apache. To him, I was only a girl lost in the storm, and yet he had given me shelter. When I looked up, our eyes met in the flicker of lamplight. His gray eyes carried the dryness of years spent alone, like cracked earth waiting for rain. For a brief moment, I felt something stir within me, a sense that perhaps I was not as alone as I had believed. I did not know then that this very dagger would bind my fate to a stranger forever. When the first light spilled across the desert, I realized the storm had only been the beginning. The air was unnaturally still after the night's violence. No birdsong, no rustle of dry grass, only silence, as if the land itself held its breath. I sat inside the barn, wrapped in the stranger's coat, staring at the dagger he had placed in my hand. Its weight was far heavier than steel. Something inside me whispered that it was not just a weapon, it was a promise, and promises are never free. The man Samuel Ward, as I would later learn, stood at the window, cradling a cup of black coffee. His shoulders were broad, but stooped with years of solitude. For a moment, he seemed nothing more than a weary rancher, a man carved from dust and loneliness. Yet when he turned, there was a sharpness in his gaze, like a soldier who had not forgotten war. I rose, meaning to thank him before leaving, but then I froze. Beyond the warped window glass, shadows lined the fence. Not one, not 10 hundreds. Warriors, their faces painted in war colors, silent as stone. 200 Apache, the morning sun glinting off their rifles and spears. My stomach dropped. My people had found me. Samuel set his cup down with a trembling hand. His face paled, but he did not reach for his gun. Instead, he opened the barn door and stepped onto the porch as if he'd known this moment would come. The warriors did not move, did not speak. They simply stared at the lonely figure of the rancher who had taken me in. Then the crowd parted, and my father walked forward. Chinoa White Crow, chief of the Chiricahua Apache, towered in his wolf pelt cloak, eagle feathers crowning his headdress. His eyes, dark and unblinking, were steady as a drawn bowstring. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then his voice rang out, cold and sharp. Samuel Ward, you know why we are here? The rancher's voice was rough, but his gaze did not waver. I do not, he answered. Father's eyes slid past him and found me. For the first time since the storm, shame scorched my chest. I stood trembling in the barn doorway, Samuel's coat around my shoulders and his dagger clutched in my hand. Gasps rippled through the warriors. I felt their eyes burn into me, not with relief at my return, but with outrage. Among my people, to accept a weapon from a man was no small matter. It was a vow of trust, a bond as sacred as blood. For me to hold the blade of a stranger of a white man was to shatter every law my father had taught me. I tried to speak, but the words tangled in my throat. All I could manage was a whisper. He saved my life. Father's jaw tightened. His gaze turned back to Samuel, voice like stone grinding on stone. The dagger in her hand, it was yours? Yes, Samuel admitted, only so she could defend herself. A murmur spread through the warriors, sharp and restless as wind in dry grass. I felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on me, heavier than the storm had been. My father's eyes narrowed, searching Samuel as though he could strip away every hidden truth. Finally, he spoke, each word deliberate, final. In our people, a woman takes a weapon only from the one she trusts with her life. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sweat slid down my spine, though the air was cool. I wanted to cry out, to explain that Samuel had meant no insult, that his act was born of mercy, not defiance. But in that moment, it no longer mattered what either of us intended. All that mattered was what the warriors saw. The daughter of White Crow holding the dagger of a white man. And in their eyes, that was enough to spark a war. My father did not strike Samuel down at once. Perhaps he wanted the truth before blood was spilled. The warriors surrounded the ranch like a ring of steel. Their horses stamped nervously, sensing the weight of silence in the air. My father stood tall, his cloak stirring in the wind, his eyes fixed on Samuel. I stood beside him, my heart pounding against the dagger in my palm. The storm had washed the land clean, leaving the earth soft and damp. It was then that one of the warriors bent low and pointed. Tracks, he said. His voice was taut as a bowstring. We followed him beyond the fence, out where the sand stretched flat and endless. There, pressed deep into the wet soil, were footprints mine, light and staggering, and alongside them, others, larger, heavier. Boots. Not moccasins of the Apache, boots of the white man. Samuel crouched, his weathered fingers brushing the impressions with a soldier's eye. She wasn't alone, he murmured. Someone was following her, someone wearing cavalry boots. A shiver coursed through me. I remembered the storm, the way I'd felt eyes burning into my back even before I collapsed. I had thought it was only my imagination, but now I knew the truth. The storm had not been the only hunter chasing me. The warriors muttered among themselves. Some looked at Samuel with suspicion, others with reluctant agreement. My father said nothing, his face carved from stone. He only stared at the tracks, then lifted his gaze to me. Did you see them? He asked. I hesitated. Shame prickled my skin. I felt them, I admitted, but I thought it was the storm. My father's lips pressed into a hard line. To admit weakness was a wound in itself, but worse was the fear in his eyes. Fear not for me alone, but for what this meant for the tribe. If I had been hunted, then the hunters wanted more than one girl. They wanted a war. Samuel rose to his full height. Though the warriors bristled, he spoke without fear. Whoever was on her trail is not finished. They'll come again. He pointed to a sharper mark in the sand, where the boot heel had dug deep. These men were moving fast. They meant to catch her before she found shelter. A murmur of agreement rippled through the younger warriors. They could not deny what their own eyes saw. Still, distrust clung to them like dust. My father's voice finally broke the silence. They are bounty hunters, men who sell lives for silver. And now they have marked my daughter. The weight of his words fell heavy on all of us. My throat tightened, and I gripped the dagger closer. I had thought Samuel's kindness was the only thing that had spared me that night, but now I realized I had simply stumbled into a storm larger than I could fathom. My father turned to Samuel, his tone low but edged with steel. You are the last man to see them before they vanished into the storm. If there is truth in you, you will ride with us. If you lie, the desert will take your bones." For a long moment, Samuel said nothing. Then, with the faintest nod, he accepted the fate placed upon him. I looked at him, torn between fear and gratitude. A stranger had saved my life, yet now he stood condemned to risk it again for the sake of proving his honor. And as I stared at the track stretching into the desert, I understood. The storm was not over. It had only changed shape. Among my people, it is said that when the wind howls too long in the canyons, it carries the voices of the betrayed. We rode into Canyon de Chelly at dawn. The cliffs towered above us, sheer walls of red stone scarred by time, their shadows deep as graves. The air was unnervingly still, the kind of silence that presses against your chest until you can barely breathe. I rode beside my father, but my eyes drifted off into Samuel Ward. His face was unreadable, yet his hand never strayed far from the rifle at his side. The warriors rode in tight formation, eyes sharp, every sense on edge. Even the horses seemed uneasy, snorting and stamping as if they, too, felt danger hidden in the stone. I remembered the tracks we had followed, and my stomach twisted. Whoever had hunted me was close. We pressed deeper into the canyon. The walls narrowed, the light dimmed, and the silence grew heavier. My father raised a hand for the riders to halt. That was when I heard it. A whisper of movement, the faint scrape of stone. Then the sky came alive with arrows. War cries exploded from the cliffs as shadows leapt from above. A rain of shafts and spears fell upon us. The horses reared, screaming. Warriors shouted, raising shields, loosing their own arrows in return. In the chaos, Samuel dismounted in a single practiced motion, pulling me down with him, just as a spear split the air where my head had been. We scrambled behind a boulder, the roar of battle swallowing everything. Smoke and dust filled my throat. My hand shook around the dagger, but Samuel's voice cut through the storm. "Stay low." I peered around the rock and froze. High above, on a narrow ledge, one of our own warriors stood. But he was not fighting. His hands moved in subtle, practiced gestures. Signals, directing the ambushers where to strike. My blood turned cold. Dakota. Samuel's shout ripped through the canyon. "There, on the ledge." He's guiding them. My father's gaze snapped upward. Fury twisted his face, and in a heartbeat his bow was drawn. The arrow flew with a sound like thunder. It struck Dakota's chest, hurling him backward into the dust. For a moment, the ambushers faltered. Their inside man was gone. Confusion spread through their ranks, and in that crack of hesitation, the Apache surged. Spears thrust, arrows flew, war cries echoed off the canyon walls. Samuel fired his rifle with calm precision, dropping a man who had raised a blade toward my father's back. The fight raged on, brutal and bloody. I clutched the dagger, forcing myself to stand, to move, to strike at the enemy who rushed too close. My heart pounded in my ears, louder than the clash of weapons. And then silence. The canyon floor was littered with bodies, both ours and theirs. The stench of blood mingled with dust and smoke. Survivors groaned where they lay. My father stood among them, chest heaving, his eyes dark as the depths of the canyon itself. I turned and saw Dakota still clinging to life, sprawled in the dirt, blood soaking his tunic. His lips trembled as he tried to speak. I knelt beside him, torn between rage and pity. "Why?" I whispered. His eyes, glassy with pain, found mine. A crooked smile tugged at his mouth. "She is the bait," he rasped. "And you have already walked into the trap." His gaze went blank, his chest stilled. A chill spread through me, colder than the storm had ever been. I lifted my head and saw my father standing over us, his face carved with anger and grief. Samuel's eyes met mine across the battlefield. In that moment, we all understood. This ambush was only the beginning. There are places even the Apache fear to tread. The Valley of Horsebones is one of them. We left the canyon in silence, carrying both our wounded and our anger. The tracks of my captors led westward, straight into a land my people had long avoided. The Valley of Horsebones where, long ago, an entire cavalry was swallowed by a sandstorm and left behind nothing but bleached remains. Some said their spirits still wandered there, whispering through the dust. The sun blazed overhead, punishing and merciless. My throat burned with thirst, but fear was sharper than any thirst. Each mile we rode, the air grew heavier, as though the earth itself resented our presence. Bones littered the sand skulls, ribs, legs of horses long turned to ash-white relics. Samuel rode close to me, his gray eyes scanning every shadow, every ridge. He had said little since the ambush, but I felt his presence like a shield at my side. Strange, how a stranger's silence could feel steadier than the noise of 200 warriors. At last, we found her. Neva. She was bound to a wooden post at the valley's end, her hair tangled, her face streaked with dust and blood. Yet her eyes, those fierce, dark eyes, still burned with fire. Around her stood the traitors, men who had once ridden under my father's banner. Now they sneered like jackals, blades glinting in the dying light. One of them stepped forward, his voice loud and cruel. "Lay down your weapons, White Crow. Kneel and confess defeat, and your wife lives." The air tightened like a drawn bow. No one moved. My father's face was stone, but I saw the storm behind his eyes. To yield would mean dishonor. To refuse would mean death for her. Before he could speak, Samuel urged his horse forward. His voice, rough but steady, rang out across the valley. "You are mistaken. This woman is not only the wife of a chief, she is proof that honor and loyalty cannot be traded away." The words fell over the valley like thunder. For a heartbeat, the traitors hesitated. Even my father turned, surprise flashing in his eyes. And then the storm broke. The first arrow flew, and chaos erupted. Warriors charged, sand exploding beneath pounding hooves. I spurred my horse forward, heart hammering, the dagger clenched tight in my fist. The traitors rushed to meet us, their war cries echoing against the red cliffs. I saw Samuel dismount, moving with the swiftness of a man who had lived too long with death. His rifle cracked, dropping an archer who had aimed for my father. I fought my way through the melee, blade flashing, until at last I reached Naira. Her bindings were thick, her arms raw from the ropes. I slashed them loose with the dagger. She collapsed into my arms, her breath ragged, but her eyes alive with fire. "I knew you would come," she whispered. Around us, the battle raged. The traitors fought fiercely, but without unity. They faltered. One by one, they fell, until at last those still breathing were bound in their own ropes, cast down into the dust they had chosen. The valley was red with sunset and blood. My father stood tall among the survivors, his cloak torn, his face drawn with both fury and relief. He placed a heavy hand on Samuel's shoulder. "You have saved my wife," he said, his voice resonant as a drumbeat. "But more than that, you have saved the honor of our people. From this day, Samuel Ward, you are no longer the lone wolf of the prairie. You are our brother." Samuel said nothing, but I saw his jaw tighten, his eyes burn with something unspoken. Perhaps pride, perhaps disbelief. I looked down at the dagger in my hand, its blade now streaked with both my blood and my enemy's. I realized then that a single act offering this weapon on a storm-torn night had bound us all to this fate. The storm had not ended. It had only carried us into the Valley of Bones, where honor itself was tested against the weight of betrayal. Night fell heavy over the valley, carrying the stench of blood and dust. The traitors were bound and dragged away, their faces pale in the flickering glow of torches. The rest of us gathered around a fire, the flames pushing back against the cold desert wind. My people sang low songs of victory and mourning, voices blending with the beat of drums. I sat apart, clutching the dagger that had once seemed only a stranger's gift. Its blade, though scarred, gleamed red in the firelight. I wondered how something so small could change the course of my life, binding my fate to Samuel Ward. He sat across the fire, shoulders bowed, pipe clenched loosely in his hands. The light carved deep lines into his weathered face. To the others, he was still an outsider, tolerated only because he had proven himself in battle. But I could see something they did not. In the hollow of his gaze lived a grief older than the desert itself. My father approached, Naira leaning against his arm. Her face was pale, but her spirit unbroken. He lowered himself beside Samuel, setting down a small leather pouch. Inside lay a silver pendant, carved in the shape of a crow. My mother's us. She would never abandon it unless forced, my father said. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of a decree. Wear it. Perhaps it will remind you of the bond you have chosen, even if you did not know it. Samuel's hand trembled as he lifted the pendant. He turned it slowly, the firelight glinting off its polished surface. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with a nod that was more solemn than any vow, he placed it over his neck. The warriors murmured among themselves. Some frowned, others nodded grudgingly. To wear the token of White Crow's wife was no small matter. It was a sign of kinship, of shared blood even if no blood had been spilled in ritual. My father looked into the flames, his voice low, meant as much for himself as for us. There are those among my people who would sell their blood for power. They took Naira, hoping to break me, to break us all. But they failed. Silence followed his words. Only the crackle of fire and the distant howl of coyotes filled the night. I studied Samuel, the pendant now resting against his chest, the dagger still at his side. He had come into our lives as a shadow from the storm, yet already he had carved himself into the story of my people. For the first time, I wondered if the spirits had sent him not as an enemy, not even as a savior, but as something far more dangerous, a man who could no longer remain outside the circle of fire. I looked up at the endless night sky, scattered with stars. My heart was still heavy with fear, but somewhere beneath that weight, something new stirred hope, or perhaps only the dangerous illusion of it. I did not yet know how deeply the storm had marked us all, nor how far the path would lead. But that night, as the firelight flickered across the crow pendant and the dagger, I understood one truth. Samuel Ward was no longer a stranger. He had become a thread in the fabric of our fate. The storm had passed, but its echoes followed us into the dawn. We rode out of the valley of horsebones in silence, the rising sun painting the bones white against the sand. Behind us lay the wreckage of betrayal. Ahead stretched the endless prairie, wide and merciless. The air was sharp, carrying the bitter scent of smoke and iron. I rode beside Samuel Ward. He said little, his eyes scanning the horizon, his hand never far from the rifle slung across his back. The crow pendant rested against his chest, gleaming in the morning light. I wondered if he felt its weight the way I did, like a chain that could never be broken. My father's voice broke the silence. They will come again. He did not need to explain who they were. The traitors had not acted alone. Somewhere beyond the horizon, other hands had pulled their strings, men who sought not only my mother's life, but the fall of our entire tribe. That thought gnawed at me. If there were more betrayals within our own, how many shadows still hid among us? By noon, we reached a ridge overlooking a stretch of desert grassland. The wind bent the tall stalks, making them ripple like waves. My father raised his hand, signaling a halt. His eyes narrowed, studying the land below. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. Tracks, dozens of them, boot prints, wagon wheels, and the scorched marks of campfires. Whoever had taken my mother had not scattered into the wilderness. They had moved with purpose, driving west, toward the mountains. Samuel dismounted, crouching to trace the marks with his fingertips. Cavalry, he muttered, but not official. Mercenaries, bounty men. His jaw tightened. Hired killers. The warriors muttered among themselves, anger sparking like dry tinder. My father's expression was grim, but steady. They think the valley will keep us away. They are wrong. As we pressed on, a strange tension grew between us. Samuel rode within the circle of warriors, now not behind, not outside. Some glared, others watched him with wary respect. He bore their stares without a word. I wondered what he thought of us, whether he saw kinship or only another battlefield. That night, we camped near a stream at the forest's edge. I sat apart, turning the dagger slowly in my hands. Its edge caught the firelight, and for a moment I saw not steel, but fate itself, sharp, merciless, and inevitable. Samuel settled near me, quiet as always. The fire painted his face in shifting shadows. At last, he spoke, his voice low, almost to himself. I buried a wife once, and a son, both taken by fever. After that, I thought there was nothing left worth fighting for. His words settled into me like embers. For the first time, I saw the truth of him, not only the soldier, not only the stranger, but a man hollowed by grief, carried forward by habit more than hope. I wanted to speak, to tell him that grief was a river my people knew well. But the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I only held his gaze, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between us. Above us, the stars burned cold and bright. Somewhere beyond the horizon, more enemies waited. But here, at the fire's edge, I felt the faint stir of something I had thought lost forever connection. The storm had bound us together. The war ahead would decide if that bond was strength or ruin. The deeper we rode into the forest, the closer the shadows seemed to follow us. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of pine and wet earth. Our horses moved carefully among the roots and rocks, their breaths steaming in the cold morning air. Every sound seemed louder beneath the trees, the snap of a twig, the creak of leather, the low murmur of warriors speaking in hushed tones. My father rode at the front, his wolf pelt cloak brushing against the mane of his horse. His silence was heavier than any command. The men knew what it meant: danger. It came when we stopped near a stream to water the horses. One of the scouts returned, his face tight with unease. He bowed his head before my father. "Tracks," he said. "But not just the enemy's. One of our own." The words fell like stones. My chest tightened. The traitors we had defeated in the canyon were not the end. There was another, still among us. The warriors stiffened, eyes darting from one to another, suspicion curling like smoke. My father's jaw set, his hand resting on the bough across his lap. "Speak the name," he commanded. The scout hesitated. His gaze shifted toward the rear of the column, where the younger warriors rode. Then he whispered, "Nasha." Gasps rippled through the camp. I felt my throat close. Nasha. He had grown beside me, trained beside me. I had once believed he would guard me with his life. Now his name was spoken like poison. Before anyone could act, Samuel's voice cut through the uproar. "Don't shout his name to the trees. If he knows you've found him, he'll run before we can corner him." The warriors turned on him, some bristling with anger at the audacity of a white man giving orders. But my father lifted a hand, silencing them. His eyes studied Samuel, weighing his words. Finally, he gave a slow nod. That night, as the fire crackled and the warriors whispered, I sat staring into the flames. My thoughts tangled like the smoke rising into the dark. Why had Nasha betrayed us? What promise of power could make a man turn against his own blood? Samuel settled beside me, his face shadowed, his pipe glowing faintly. He did not look at me when he spoke. I've seen it before. Men who lose faith, who think gold will keep them warm when honor won't. They forget that betrayal always ends the same way. His words chilled me more than the night air. I wanted to believe he was wrong, that Nasha had been tricked or forced. But deep down, I knew the truth. Betrayal does not grow from nothing. It takes root in silence, in envy, in wounds left to fester. I touched the crow pendant at my neck, the silver cold against my skin. My mother had always said that loyalty was the thread that bound our people together. Now that thread was fraying, strand by strand. Across the fire, my father sat apart, his face carved with sorrow he would never speak aloud. He had fought 100 battles, but I feared this wound, the wound of betrayal from within, would cut deeper than any blade. When I lay down to rest, the forest seemed alive with whispers. The shadows stretched long and restless, as though the trees themselves carried the betrayer's name. And I knew that before this road ended, we would face him. Nasha, brother once, enemy now. The land remembers every betrayal. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it screams. We followed the tracks westward until the desert gave way to broken stone and shadowed cliffs. My people called this place the Valley of Echoes, where the wind carried back every word threefold, as though the spirits themselves repeated what they heard. It was fitting, I thought, that we would find betrayal here. The scouts had found fresh signs, boot prints, wagon ruts, the faint ash of abandoned fires. The bounty hunters had passed through not long before, and with them, surely, Nasha. My chest tightened each time I thought his name. By dusk, we entered the valley. The cliffs rose high and close, their faces scarred with cracks and ledges. The air was cool, but heavy with unease. Each hoofbeat echoed too loud. Each breath returned in whispers. Even the horses tossed their heads nervously, as if they felt eyes watching from above. I gripped the dagger at my side, the weight of it grounding me. Samuel rode a little ahead, his rifle balanced across his lap. His presence was steady, like the old cottonwood trees that weather every storm. But even he could not still the tremor in the air. The ambush came swift as lightning. Arrows hissed down from the ridges. A rifle cracked, the shot ringing 3 times across the canyon walls. Warriors shouted, scattering for cover. The air filled with dust and war cries. My father raised his bow, loosing shafts with calm precision, each one finding its mark. I spurred my horse behind a boulder, heart pounding. Samuel slid from his saddle beside me, returning fire with practiced calm. They've set the high ground, he growled. They'll pin us here unless we break their line. And then I saw him. Nasha. He stood on the ledge above, bow in hand, his war paint smeared, his eyes sharp with something colder than anger resolve. He was not forced, not tricked. He had chosen this path, chosen to stand against us. Our eyes met. For an instant, time seemed to fracture. Memories of shared hunts, of laughter around the fire, of whispered promises of loyalty all shattered in that single gaze. He loosed an arrow. It struck the stone inches from my head, splintering sparks. My breath caught, half in fear, half in grief. I wanted to cry out his name, to beg him to stop. But Samuel's hand gripped my arm. Don't. He made his choice. The words cut deeper than the arrow ever could. The battle surged. My people fought with desperate fury, climbing the rocks, dragging the traitors down into the dust. Samuel's rifle cracked again and again, his focus unbroken even as the enemy pressed close. I forced myself to fight, slashing with the dagger, my arms trembling but unyielding. At last, the echoes quieted. The enemy broke, fleeing deeper into the valley. Bodies lay scattered on the stone, their blood black in the fading light. But Nasha was gone, slipped into the shadows like a ghost. My father stood among the wounded, his chest heaving, his eyes burning. He did not speak of his grief, but I saw at the wound deeper than any arrow. I sat trembling in the dust, the dagger slick in my hand. The valley was silent now, save for the faint whisper of the wind. But even in silence, I heard it the echo of his name. Nasha, once my brother, now my enemy. And somewhere ahead, he waited for us. The farther we followed Nasha's trail, the more the land itself seemed to bleed. We left the Valley of Echoes at dawn, the cliffs still whispering our voices back to us. My people rode in grim silence. Each man carried the weight of betrayal like a stone on his chest. My father did not speak of it, but I could see how his eyes hardened, how his voice grew sharp with every command. Betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from kin. The trail led us through burned grasslands where blackened earth stretched as far as the eye could see. Once, these fields had been fertile, grazed by buffalo and deer. Now they were ash and silence. The bounty hunters had passed here, and they left nothing living in their wake. I rode beside Samuel. His rifle lay across his lap, the crow pendant glinting against his chest. He had said little since the battle, but I could feel the storm in him. His silence was not emptiness. It was a man balancing on the edge of something dangerous. As we pressed on, we found signs of their cruelty. A homestead, its cabins burned to skeletons of charred wood. Wagons overturned, wheels split. And in the ashes, bones men, women, children. The fire had spared nothing. One of the younger warriors cursed aloud, his voice breaking. My throat tightened, but I held back tears. To weep now would only give the dead more silence. They deserved vengeance, not pity. Samuel dismounted, kneeling among the ashes. He sifted through the blackened soil with his calloused hands, his jaw locked tight. When he rose, his face was grim as stone. These weren't soldiers, he said, just settlers. They burned them to cover their tracks, to make us fear. My father's voice was iron. Then we will give them reason to fear us instead. We pressed on into the evening, the horizon glowing red with sunset. The trail grew clearer, boot prints pressed deep into the soft earth, wagon ruts cutting scars through the land. They were leading us somewhere, drawing us west, toward the mountains. That night, we camped at the edge of the burned plain. The fire crackled low, throwing long shadows across weary faces. I sat apart, the dagger resting across my knees. I turned it slowly, wondering if its steel remembered each life it had taken. Samuel joined me, as he often did. He didn't ask permission, he simply sat, lighting his pipe, the smoke curling pale against the stars. After a while, he spoke, his voice low, meant only for me. "They're driving us," he said. "Every move, every fire, every trail they want us to follow. It's not just about your mother, it's about breaking your people in the open, where they control the ground." I shivered, though the night was warm. "Then why follow?" His eyes flicked to the flames, then back to me. "Because sometimes the only way out of a trap is to walk straight through it. But you walk with your eyes open and your hand on steel." His words settled heavy in my chest. I thought of Nasha, of his bow aimed at me, of his eyes hard with betrayal. Once I had trusted him without question. Now he had become the blade waiting in the dark. I clutched the pendant at my neck, the silver crow cold against my skin. My mother's life still hung in the balance. If I faltered, if any of us faltered, we would lose more than blood. We would lose the bond that held us together. As the fire sank low, I lifted my eyes to the horizon. The mountains loomed there, jagged and dark, waiting like teeth. And I knew the path ahead would not only test our strength, it would test our souls.